and the Cedars of Sonoma County is one of California's hotspots for ecological diversity. The geology of serpentine and ultramafic rock is characterized by high iron and magnesium content. It is formed deep in the Earth's mantle and surfaced through the subduction process. This island of mantle rock is embedded in Sonoma County within the Coast Range of Northern California. The Cedars is characterized by its dramatic topography, featuring deep canyons and rich red-colored rock. Ultrabasic springs, that's a pH of higher than 11, create another layer of geology. These unique conditions have given rise to a rich ecology, including newly discovered microorganisms, insects, and 5 endemic plant species. Author and lecturer Roger Raiche is a founding partner of the Cedars Science Program and Planet Horticulture Landscape Design, which he co-owns with David McCrory, who's present this evening. Roger is renowned for his keen observational skills and encyclopedic knowledge of the California Flora. For several decades, he curated the California native plant section of the UC Berkeley Botanical Garden. He authored the entire grass, sedge, and rush section of the UC Press book, Wild Lilies, Irises, and Grasses, Gardening with California Monocots. Roger discovered and published several new species, including 3 at the Cedars. 3 other California plant species have been named in his honor. Roger has facilitated numerous scientific expeditions across a wide range of disciplines. And Fremontia has published an article called The Cedars, Sonoma County's Hidden Treasure, and the creation of the BLM Area of Critical Environmental Concern, ACEC, at the Cedars, and the permanent conservation of the main canyon at the Cedars were decades-long goals that have been achieved. So Roger has also been honored by being named a fellow of the California Native Plant Society. Please welcome Roger.
Hi, thank you. You can hear me, right?
Yep.
Okay, so the Cedars has long been a fascination of mine, and I first hiked into the canyon back in 1981, though I had seen the area from King Ridge Road back in 1980, one of the early years of mine in California, and I just thought the place just looked really amazing from a distance and always wanted to explore it. And the next year I was able to do that, and fortunately met a neighboring, one of the landowner down the road who was very kind and generous, Betty Campbell, and she said, well, I don't own the land up there, but no one's up there. Why don't you go look at it? And I did, and I kept coming back. It was just an amazing place, and it's never, even today, after 45 years, it's still, I just can't believe it's there when I go up there. So anyway, we'll start. You can see some of the topography. This is the basically the Cedars is about 6,000 acres, depending on what you add to it, of serpentine or ultramafic rock, and so it's a big area, and it's several watersheds. The 2 major watersheds is the one we're looking at in this introduction picture is Azalea Creek, which is part of the Big Austin Creek watershed. Austin Creek has 2 major watersheds. Big Austin Creek goes down by Cazadero and out to the Russian River, whereas East Austin Creek, which would be to my left in this picture over the ridge, is separate for about 15 miles before it joins up with Big Austin Creek. And so the very distinct areas, you get to the East Austin Creek, if you can get there, via west of Healdsburg, whereas this side of the Cedars you get to from the Russian River or Cazadero. There's some western drainages that actually form headwaters creeks of the Wheatfield fork of the Walala River, and those actually drain northwest and join the Walala River, which drains out to the ocean. So the Austin Creek drains into the Russian River, the other creeks drain into the Walala River. So it's actually, there's 2 rivers involved in where the water goes from the cedars. So anyway, we'll start. Let's see, why doesn't it move? Oh, there it is. I labeled all of them, so you can just read the text if you, or you can't understand my voice, or you'd rather just look at the pictures. But it's really a maze of intersecting canyons. Of course, they all drain gradually down to a bigger and bigger canyon. Why isn't this? But we should remember that the whole area was part of the Kashaya Pomo group of Native Americans back long before Europeans came here. And we don't really know how they impacted the area with their particular cultural techniques, but the flora of this part of Sonoma County was definitely over the hundreds of years of their stewardship was impacted. So the plants, when the first Europeans or Russians or whatever came here, found were a landscape highly impacted by the Native Americans. We have no evidence of them actually focusing on the Cedars area. There's no remnants of or artifacts found, but it's a very erosive environment. So it probably, they probably visited it, but we don't think they spend much time. All the purple on this geology map are serpentine outcrops going into Lake County. You can see the Lake Sonoma serpentines. The Cedars is off by itself, and this is the 6,000 acre part, but it has a tail end that actually eventually almost goes out to the Dry Creek Valley. But in this area is interesting because some of this is in the Austin Creek State Recreation Area. So some of the plants, many of the plants of the cedars also use this as an avenue or just exist on these ultramafics. So although it's very hard to get into the cedars, some of these may be viewable in the state park, though the state park does not feature them or encourage access to them. But just so you know, it's the serpentine is, I'll use the most common word for is the rock. I use serpentine, but it's actually a ferromagnesium rock, which means it's more than 70% iron and magnesium, which the geologic term is ultramafic, ultra high in mafic is magnesium and thick iron, which is formed in the upper mantle. Peridotite is one of the igneous forms of the mantle rock, and then it gets metamorphosed. It's hydrated with water and other things in the process of moving from the mantle up into the crust and ocean bottoms and getting crushed into continental collides and stuff like that. And when it's hydrated, the crystal form of it is altered and it's called serpentinite. But both can occur together. Some areas like the cedars, it's a mix of both rocks. There's about 75% peridotite and about 25% serpentinite. But a lot, that metamorphic process of changing from one to the other is actually happening in real time in the cedars, which makes it of great interest to scientists. They don't have to go in diving bells under the ocean and things like that to see this happen. They can enter a nice canyon and camp out for a week and do their studies. So it's a very convenient place if they have work involving the serpentine rock. The high points of serpentine rock, it's high in magnesium, too high for most plants to really do well in, although every plant needs a little magnesium. They don't need a lot. It's very low in calcium. It'd be rather they had a lot of calcium and little magnesium, but it's the opposite. And it's low in normal plant nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. In addition, went back there, it has heavy metals, nickel, chromium, and cobalt, and it's low in molybdenum. Anyway, there are these also ultrabasic springs. Ultrabasic means the pH of the water is greater than 11. And here you can see on this register, it's a 12.11, which is very, very basic. The pH scale goes from 14 to 0, 7 being neutral. So most people used to think that these ultrabasic waters were essentially too basic, and there's no nutrients or anything in the water, very few, that almost nothing would be able to live in this environment. But they've actually found a number of nutrients, and a lot of studies continue trying to measure them and see what they're doing in these springs. The ultrabasic springs and other springs in the cedar, they don't have to be ultrabasic, but because of the serpentinization process, happens underground in fissures, and there two gases are released, hydrogen and methane. You can see in here where someone's burning methane caught in this canister, and these are bubbles, which you would see if you're there in the daylight, where these gases are bubbling up in the springs. And another thing that comes up with the ultrabasic springs is high levels of calcium hydroxide, which as soon as it's released from these fissures underground, which is anaerobic, they're close to the atmosphere of carbon dioxide, and they form calcium carbonate, which is the same chemically as limestone or marble or some of these other. Limestone can be formed, or calcium carbonate can be formed in a lot of ways on the planet, but this is a very interesting way, and it's also been proposed as a way of mitigating too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by forcing serpentinization artificially, but they haven't quite worked out the kinks yet. Anyway, beautiful little micro terrace basins you see in these things. Sometimes over the centuries, it's built up layers over waterfalls or cliffs and stuff like that. Some of these, the surface deposits can be thousands of years old. So this calcium carbonate deposits started, who knows, long ago. We've never done drilling to actually measure it. I don't think anyone's that concerned with it, but fortunately, calcium carbonate is very easy to radiocarbon date. So you get good data on it. And another feature that affects the plants as well as just the weirdness of the environment is the calcium carbonate coming up through creek alluvium that washes down from the crumbling cliffs and stuff, ends up over very great periods of time cementing it together. And it's a very hard surface. It's almost impenetrable. So where this sometimes called calcrete occurs, the creek always in the summer has to flow over it because it can't penetrate it, and it exposes the water to a lot of sun, which means the water gets warmer. But it's also almost impenetrable for plant roots. So you see it's generally very open because very few plants other than Brewer's willow can get there, even started on this and survive the winter flows. This is the biggest calcium carbonate formation in one of the side canyons of Big Austin Creek called the Blob. It's on property of one of our neighbors here in Guerneville, the DeCarley family. It's really an amazing feature. But economically, the cedars was basically used for two pursuits. The mining of magnesite. Magnesite is important in iron production and, those fire bricks that are in chimneys, and they used to make fire resistant plasters and things like that out of the magnesium carbonate. Their deposits of those were mostly on the outskirts of the Cedars, almost entirely in East Austin Creek, part of the Cedars. And they had tunnel mines. Some of these mines went in thousands of feet. There's histories of the tunnel mines. They even had a small gauge railroad to get up to this one. And even today, if you fly over in a helicopter, these white streaks you'll see on some of the hillsides there are the tailings from the magnesite mining. And interestingly enough, one of the streptanthus, the jewel flowers, loves these magnesite tailing slopes, but we're not there yet with that plant. Another thing in Big Austin Creek, chromite mining was the economic activity. These were surface mines where they just trying to find areas where there were good deposits, where there's a high percentage of the chromium. It's a heavy metal. It's the heaviest ingredient in the ambient rock, but most of the rock only has small percentages, but it's really dense like this is black stuff. That was what they were after, so they blast it out and carry it down to what's called the stamp mill, where it was pulverized by this piston-like thing, which was the stamp part of it, and crushed up, mixed with water, and then went out on these shaking tables, and the lighter rock particles washed off, and the heaviest particles, which were chromite, they could just collect after they got rid of the other stuff. So the plants, that's what most of you are interested in. There are some similarities between the plant life at the Cedars and some of the serpentine or ultramafic areas in Marin. You definitely have Sargent cypress, and you have chaparrals that are similar, but some of the elements are different. But they're basically four communities. The cypress woodland, Sargent cypress, there's only one cypress in the Cedars. There's chaparral, where the cypresses are missing or not occupying the space. But many of the chaparral plants occur under the cypresses as well. There's a riparian zones. Most of both Big and East Austin Creek have extensive creeks that are either permanent water through the summer, or as you move up in the side canyons become intermittent, but it fosters its own riparian community. Here we're mostly seeing cypress, but there are other elements. And then seepages, the barrens, forgot to say, you see a lot of barrens. And seepages, there's none visible in this picture, but they are also water identified plant communities, but they're generally up from the creeks because the creeks have too much winter scouring for most of the seepage plants to survive for any period of time. And you all know the serpentine has completely vegetation differences from, this is non-serpentine here, facing the same direction. Serpentine is all chaparral. The subcypress further up we're not seeing. This is all Doug fir, redwoods, madrones, canyon oak, coast live oak, things like that. The interface, though, is we're not seeing much of it here because of the angle, but where the two meet together, there's also often a blending, sometimes very narrow, maybe 10, 15 feet, sometimes 100 feet. And these blends of serpentine from one realm and crust rock from another realm, sometimes volcanic, sometimes sediments and stuff, produces a whole separate little ring around the Cedars of this, I'll call the outer Cedars, which has an interesting flora, a subflora of its own. Many of those subflora things do not occur within the main canyon, which we'll mostly focus on, but I like to mention it all. Here, the Sargent cypress cover almost all the ridge tops within the Cedars. It looks like chaparral from a distance, but this is all cypress. There'll be manzanitas and chamise and toyon and stuff like that under the cypress where they're more open. But where you have dense cypress forests, you get, you see the shadows there. These are some very, very tall cypress in this swell. We call this the swell of the giants. There's a whole shaded understory, which is really quite interesting. And again, the sort of, it looks like a blanket of Sargent cypress. The slopes, because they're more fragmented and they're decomposing and falling apart, tend to not have cypress forest, though they can be occasional. And sometimes you're just not sure. This slope, for some reason, it's south facing, which is a little more arid than most, but it's a very arid area. And this is all chaparral. So sometimes there's no quite great explanation for whether you have a chaparral or a cypress woodland. When it is foggy, the cypresses are very effective, as you probably know from your the cypress forest in Marin, like on Carson Ridge and stuff, where they're just drip and drip and drip, which adds a lot to the rainfall, which doesn't occur in the summer. But oddly, the cedars is, although it does get fog, the rock, the mass of rock there seems to get so hot in the summer that it forms a bubble that excludes the fog, will go around the cedars and just hits the edges of the cedars. So a lot of these cypresses don't actually get the moisture. They can see across the canyon their neighboring cypresses getting. So so it's kind of an interesting hit or miss thing there. And again, I mentioned the stability. The talus slopes are so unstable. It's just rock falling apart and sliding downhill that you might get cypresses or some vegetation in the center where there's a little more water. But this is all cypress over here. This is more bedrock peridotite. So it's more suitable. The cypresses prefer that red, more hard soil. Cypresses, especially where they're more stressed, can be very dwarf. This doesn't mean they're young. These can be just as old as the big cypresses here. The fire record of the cedars is patchy, but I believe these are probably at least 100 years old here, and many of the ones in the background are in similar age, but they're much taller. They're very cute. They look like some fanatic gardener has been hanging out there, camping under them and printing them every day. But they're very, very beautiful. And then there's giant ones that are at least 300 years old, and with the girth at the bottom that takes two people to get their arms around. This one is isolated from other cypress, so it has less competition, which may be a contributing factor. But apparently, just there are a lot of old forests in the cedars. So there's some areas, apparently in the past, when there were fires, not everything burned at once. So it was a mosaic, and some areas survived for one reason or another, and the cypress just kept on growing, although they do senesce on their own, and the number of truly old cypresses are somewhat limited. And there's also a new worry. There's whole areas I've noticed in the last 15 years, in particular, last 10 years specifically, big patches, this is several acres, where all the cypresses are just dying completely. But the understory doesn't die. And in fact, they're quite happy that the cypresses are gone and they're freed from competition and use all the rainfall and nutrients. But it's worrisome. And we've had several pathologists out, like Christopher Lee from UK, Arcata. So underneath and transitioning into the pure chaparral areas are two manzanitas that are kind of distinctive to the cedars. You don't have either of these in Marin, although we have a lot of great manzanitas in Marin. One is the Cedars manzanita, which is a subspecies of the Baker manzanita. The Baker manzanita is a rare endemic south of the Russian River near Occidental and Camp Meeker. Again, mostly growing on serpentine, but it also grows on some sand barrens. And then there's the sticky or white-leaf manzanita, which reaches its southern limit in Sonoma County. I think you might have one shrub, but I think you have the Sierran form of the Arcephalus viscida in Marin, or at least you did at one point. Jim Roof used to write about it. But this reaches its southern limit at the Cedars in the Outer Coast Range. And then on Hood Mountain, there's another population up in the Sargent Cypress Forest there. But it does not go south of the Russian River in the Outer Coast Ranges, and it doesn't go south of Hood Mountain in the Miocnus Range. So, but going north, this goes all the way up into southwestern Oregon. So it's an interesting range extreme. This is a beautiful old manzanita sitting alone on the barrens, looking at the great views. That's a Cedars manzanita. This is the white leaf or sticky manzanita. This tends to prefer the harsher soils. You see it where the cypress forest reaches an edge and turns into rock. And then there's 5 ceanothus that occur in the cedars. This is the most serpentine identified, the Ceanothus jepsonii, which you have in Marin. This is also the blue form, which is in western Sonoma County. It's interesting, the Bohemian Highway serpentines have a mixed color form race. And then the next population of serpentine to the northeast of the cedars is Lake Sonoma, where they're almost pure white. So white with a pale blue coloration, but you won't see the blue color again as you go further north. This only occurs on serpentine. It has this vicious holly-like leaves. My dog hates walking through it, especially when it's dead. It's just really cruel. But it's a very distinctive ceanothus because Jepsonii ceanothus is one of the few ceanothus that have more than 5 floral parts. Most of them are 6 petals, or sometimes there'll be 7 or even 8, though 8 is very rare. But almost every other ceanothus in California have 5 petals, so it's an aberration within the genus, and it loves serpentine and is found only on serpentine pretty much. Deer brush comes to it comes down into Sonoma County, not in a strong way, but there are some on the East Austin Creek side of the Cedars, which burned in 2020. It's actually, I didn't realize it was a resprouter. It comes back really vigorously. But another sort of fire follower, although on the non-burned areas, you see Ceanothus parrii, very rare. I think you have that in Marin, I'm not sure. But it's very common away from the coast in Sonoma County, on serpentine and non-serpentine, and it tends to come up extensively after a burn. It comes up by the thousands and thousands, and suddenly within 20 years, it's hard to find any anymore, but the seed is all there in the soil waiting for the next catastrophe. Within the areas of the cedars that are not burned, the old cypress forests, every time a tree falls or you grade a road or you make a fire pile, you'll see Ceanothus parrii suddenly appearing as if from nowhere, and they'll come up for a number of years and do their thing. It's very beautiful. It's a nice gentian blue, pale blue, but it's not a long-lasting shrub. It's meant to come up quick and in great numbers and then disappear. Ceanothus cuneatus, the variety of ramulosis, is blue. It's not it doesn't carry very well, but this is the blue form of buckbrush, which I know you have in Marin, Western Marin. The eastern side of the cedars, though, you only have the white form, the more typical form that's found throughout California of Ceanothus cuneatus. But the west side has some of the blue ones. There'll be some white ones in there too. And unfortunately, they occur with Ceanothus foliosus. I'm sorry, I'm a little ahead of myself. This is Ceanothus foliosus, let's deal with that. Another fire follower, small crinkly leaves, little pom-pom flowers, very beautiful. Again, generally short-lived, comes up in disturbance areas, whether they're fires or bulldozers or landslides or whatever have you. Forms beautiful, spectacular plants. You think, oh, I got to go to the nursery and buy one of these. And then, but they don't last very long in gardens, but in nature, they can be really beautiful. This does hybridize, though, with the Ceanothus parrii I mentioned, and they often come up next to each other in burn areas or disturbance areas. And for a couple of years, it's almost impossible to tell foliosus seedlings from parrii seedlings. But within 3 years, they start to separate, differentiate in features, and you realize, oh, this one's going to become a 6-foot shrub, and this is going to stay a 3-foot mound. But it's kind of fascinating. They seem to share some genetic background and then differentiated. Another endemic shrub for the cedars is the cedars form of the ocean spray, or holodiscus. You know, holodiscus in Marin, it's all over Marin. And, but you don't have it on serpentine in Marin. It's always on those other rock types, and especially along the coastal bluffs and such. The form in the cedars has very tiny leaves, red, ruby red new growth, very sparse growth that you can see through. Because it's in the rose family, has divergent, dimorphic growth forms. The new canes come out very big and robust with almost normal size holodiscus leaves, but within a year, the side branches are all in this size range. And here's James Reveal, who helped me publish this originally. You can see this is actually a fairly big shrub, but you can see the rocks behind it which I call very skeletal, is one of the characters of it. And in hot summers, it loses all its leaves and it goes summer deciduous. If it's down by a creek and in or shady woods, it sometimes will hold its leaves into the fall. Leather oak is one of the dominant trees of the cedars or shrubs, depending on how old it is. And it's a very beautiful, charismatic oak. Some of the older ones are just spectacular. They get 15, 25 feet tall if they haven't burned. If they do burn, they just resprout and live forever. And especially in the old Sargent cypress woodland, where almost everything else that came up originally from a disaster at some point in the distant past, like the Octostaphylos or the Ceanothus or whatever, those have all died out in the old cypress forest. But the leather oak and actually the cream bush are two plants that will persist from initially sun situations to dead, and they can get very big. You can here's a trunk of one that's about 30 feet tall in one of the older woodlands of the cedars. Most people don't see leather oak that old, but I'm sure you have plenty in Marin County as well. Sonoma County has a lot of old groves of leather oak that haven't burned for some reason or other. Here you can see one on one of the bluffs, the size of the trunk there. This is probably 200 or 300 years old. One of my previous dogs, Daisy, is investigating what's growing on the trunk. And other chaparral plants, toyon, and Garrya elliptica grows in slightly richer areas, as does the tone. Some of the subshrubs, the shrubs that you see mixed in with the different things will actually indicate how harsh the situation is depending on the mixture of shrubs. Toyon and the Garrya the silk tassel tend to indicate a slightly richer, lusher, moister, cooler situation than just the manzanitas or the ceanothus would if they were growing in the sun. Oddly, almost every single Garrya I've seen in this, it seems to be Garrya Fremontia, but I'm not an expert on the genus. I know you have Garrya Marin on your serpentines too, but in the cedars, almost every single plant is female. I have yet to see a handsome male draped in the lianas of male flowers, but somehow they do produce seed. So I don't know if the pollen is coming long distance from the coast, or they're just somehow figured out a way of avoiding the males and getting seed anyway. But it's an interesting oddity. The understories of the richer woodlands, the old cypress, you'd see the girth on this cypress here, can be very rich and diverse. When the dominant plants is this, you can't really pull it out here, but the greener little tussock is Carrot globosa, I call it the cedar's turf. And then there's mixed true grasses, there's Melica, and there's a lot of forbs in here. You have things like the the milkwort and wallflowers, and there'll be those orchids, the terrestrial orchids, the Piperia or Platanthera are all in here. And if you took a block of this and analyze it, there's usually over 24 plants in these rich mixtures, which is exceptional for them. But these are more isolated. Most of the harder chaparral areas have simpler understories, and there's even grasslands of fescues. I know you have a lot of fescue grasslands in Marin County. Both Idaho fescue and California fescue occur in some of the grasslands at the cedars, but they're more on the outskirts. We even have one area that's a grassland of serpentine. It's not in this picture, but serpentine reedgrass, which you also have in Marin, and but it's strictly confined to the western edge of the cedars where the fog hangs out rather than coming into the canyon. So it has extra moisture. It's an interesting distribution, fog distribution, relictual plant. So here's some of the understories. You all know milkmaids. It used to be Polygala, now it's Rhinotropis. The Monardella, the deer mint. In the cedars, you have the viridis, which is a more common in Sonoma County on volcanics, but in the cedars, it's the deer mint of the cedars. Just south of the Russian River on the serpentines of the Bohemia Ranch, you have a whole different species, the Monardella purpurea, which you have on your Marin serpentines. But that doesn't make it north of the Russian River, except to jump up to Donor County, and those serpentines way north. Some of these are deciduous plants, herbaceous plants. The milkmaids, one of the first things to come up, I love it. I always look forward to seeing my first milkmaid in the fall or early winter. This year I saw some in early November because we had early rains. The race in the cedars often has very beautifully modeled leaves or cut leaves. They're all sort of kidney shaped, very silvery. They almost look like, those who know the horticulture genus cyclamen, they're very reminiscent of some of those species. And they come up, one of the first things to flower, as I said, November, December. January is its peak month. And except when you go into shadier or higher areas, they actually have a long season. But as soon as, even before it starts drying up, they start going dormant and set seed in March. And by April, they're almost disappearing already. It's the plant in the cedars that most clearly identifies with the rainy season. It waits till maybe 5 weeks after the first rain comes up, and it disappears 5 weeks before sometimes 5 weeks before the last rain. It's got its job done. It's set seed, had its time in the sun or shade. They have three of the terrestrial orchids, the piparias. Now, many of them are in Plantanthera. They'll probably all be in Plantanthera sooner or later. And I don't really care about the name changes anymore. They just got to roll with it. It was a habenaria when I first learned it. This one is almost it's not a cedars endemic, but it's the most common species, Leptopetala. You can see the very narrow petals. This can also be in green or a pure white form. And it comes up everywhere in good years, in the chaparral, the margins of the talus slope, cypress woodland. The other two are less common. They're more of a north slope or richer soil. The transversa with its, this is one of the short spurred one. Transversa is one of the long spurred ones with the ladder-like effect of flowers. This will come up a little later than Leptopetala. And then the last one to come up is elongata, which is almost always just on very steep north-facing slopes in fairly well-developed soil. And it needs a good year to really show off. Most years they have stems in the 6 to 8 inch range if you're lucky, which is very beautiful. But in wet years, they can have stalks 2 or even 2.5 feet tall, which is very rare, but it's nice to see. And that's not restricted to serpentine, but anyway, one of my favorite plants, of course, is the California Raiche, which I discovered in quotes back in 1982. And I was very fortunate that I noticed it. Not fortunate, it was fortunate for my life. I just really love to have a plant named after me. But anyway, everyone else had missed it. Oddly, not oddly, sorry, words are coming too fast. Ironically, the plant had been collected previously by one of the first botanists of the cedars, Fried Hoffman, who had made specimens of this in 1950 from the East Austin Creek side of the cedars. Unfortunately, his specimens had been neglected in the herbaria like in 1963, when a monograph had been done on Calicortis. No one noticed that there was this strange Calicortis that Hoffman had collected that didn't really match either Mobilis, the widespread yellow one in Sonoma County, or Pulchellus, as known from Mount Diablo region. So anyway, it ended up named for me, and it is one of the strictest endemics of the cedars. It never wanders off of the cedars. There are whole parts of the cedars that don't even have it. So it's kind of a mystery plant. It's very, very common, though. It's the cypress of the cypress woodland. There are four other, not cypress, I would say it's the calochortus of the cypress, but there are four other calochortus that occur in the area. Mobilis is widespread. It's usually on the fringes or the richer areas, particularly in East Austin Creek. There's also Tolmii, the white pussy ears, which occurs in the higher elevations of some parts of the cedars and some of the richer margins, but it's mostly off of serpentine in the canyon outside of the cedars. And then it's only three. The other calochortus that you'll see in the region, but very rarely, is Calochortus vesti, which is one of the Mariposa type lilies, which grows in serpentine clay on the outskirts of the cedars, but very, very uncommon. I've only seen it a few times myself. But Raiche is fairly common. And we had a peak year of flowering. Most years have not been peak. I haven't seen a peak year since 2000 when this occurred. You can see the numbers can be quite prolific. They're everywhere, and nice sized plants, a foot to 2 feet tall. But even it still has its characteristic things of most of the lower branches abort, and almost all the flowers are terminal flowers at the tips or the branches at the very top of these things, which makes sense. It's a very late flowering calochortus. It's almost a month and sometimes after Amabilis. So things are drying up, the soil's getting hot. There's no great incentive to be close to the ground and things like that. They may have, the reason for the late season, I'm not quite sure though. That's the way it is. And another lily, member of the lily family, the fritillaria, is very common and throughout the cedars here and there, mostly in the more woodsy areas. It's the same color range, which you'd see in Marin County or anywhere else in Sonoma County, almost from a yellow to the burgundies and green and checkers and all that kind of stuff. It's a very nice thing to see, usually around April in the cedars. The warrior plume is very, very common in the cedars. Almost every inch of the cypress woodlands have warrior plumes under them, as well as much of the chaparral and into some of the other woodlands. So some of the woodlands where their cypress don't occur, the bay woodlands and some of the oak woodlands, have much less of the Indian warrior than the cypress. It seems to like cypress woodlands and the chaparrals, which have manzanitas, which they particularly like. But it's the feature plant of March. Almost no one goes to the cedars in March. It's too early. It could rain any day. So very few people get to see it, but you have tons of warrior plume in Marin, so you're not lacking in its performance there. So just a very, very lovely hemiparasite. It attaches itself to roots of other plants. In the cedars, it seems to also be the larval host food for the checker spot butterfly. In many places, checker spot use Diplacus or Antiochus, the orange monkey flower, and we have very few of those in the cedars except after fires. And so this plant, they seem to have moved on to this because there's so much of it. And sometimes you go look for them in the end of March or April, and like, where are the warrior plumes going? You find these little skeletons of leaves and stuff, and you see caterpillars munching away. So it's an important wildlife plant. And there's a couple of variants that you see very rarely, the yellow and the peach, but most of them are just a normal scarlet. But they come up, the leaves come up scarlet and then turn green later, and the flowers are very scarlet. There's a lot of different color races of warrior plume. Another endemic, the serpentine fleabane, Erythron serpentinus, is almost a strict endemic. It's 99% of the plants known occur strictly in the cedars, and it's a very strange thing. You'd probably never notice it unless you were botanically inclined. It has these tiny white, very narrow little, almost like rosemary-like leaves, and almost no leaves at all, wiry stems. The flowers are kind of, by normal standards, we'd call pathetic. And They have very few petals, usually 9 to 13. This is an exception here. This one probably got a double dose of some gene. But it's very common throughout the cedars. It's in those grassland I mentioned. Every other plant will be this, but unless it's in flower, you really don't notice it. And it's because of its rarity, it's been collected by CNPS and other groups like the Botanical Garden, Berkeley. And here you see the more typical flowers. One of the more distinct characters about it is although it has 9 to 13 petals, they're irregularly arranged. It always looks like someone has plucked petals out of that, I love you not, and you never have a complete, perfectly rotate ring of petals. So it's kind of a fairly distinctive if you come across it, because not many other ones do that. So the riparian zones are also interesting. They're kind of limited in vegetation because the water vacillates so quickly during the season. You can see here, there's some water down the bottom of this little trough here. But in the winter, the water will go from here over to the bank, which you don't even see, in peak rainfall. So anything that's down here just has to sustain enormous force of water, rock boulders running over you, landslides. It's a hard life in the winter, even though it's wet. But there are things that do grow in these habitats. There's two main divisions between the watersheds. The East Austin Creek has a very different growth habit of the riparian zones than the Big Austin Creek side. This is Big Austin Creek. You see the cypresses are very occasional, very little shade. There's some shrubs, there's willows and azaleas, and maybe if you're lucky, a calycanthus or two, coffee berries, things like that. But it's mostly an open area. The water's mostly exposed to the sun. Whereas if you go over to East Austin Creek, the lower part of the drainage anyway, the most extreme part of the upper drainage is more like Big Austin Creek. It's mostly open and cypresses, but this is choked with alders, white alders. It's a very wide watershed. It's actually bigger than Big Austin Creek. But anyway, that's how they named it. But East Austin Creek, it's a very, very beautiful, very rich areas. It's much more mesic in many ways, even though it's farther inland than the west side of the Cedars, which you'd think being closer to the coast would be a little more moist. But anyway, the alders are everywhere, and further up where the channel closes in, they form a very dense canopy, very shady. You have some plants, understory and tussocks, the torrent sedge and things like that. And unfortunately, because the East Austin Creek watershed, I didn't mention it earlier, the upper side, the east side of it is non-serpentine. So a lot of rubble from up on the ridges washes down that's not serpentine. So unlike the west side, which is entirely self-contained ultramafic watershed, this gets more not only soil and rocks and things washing down, which can alleviate some of the toxicity for plants, most plants, it's serpentine. But you also get more weeds, blackberries, French broom, Scotch broom, and things have become pest problems. Whereas in Big Austin Creek, there's almost no weeds present at all, and which is sad, but that's just the way it is. The alders are very good at making their own nitrogen, so the lack of nitrogen is not a hardship. One of the most common in both watersheds is the brewer's willow, which is a shrub willow. At most, it might get 12, 15 tall. You get scraggly, but some of them are very, head high. This is the male one. The male flower is very beautiful in March. The females have very nice female flowers too, the soft pussies, and the two occur on separate shrubs, and but the males are showy with all the pollen. You really can't see the yellow pollen there that much, but Um, and it's also because it has a number of characters that suit being a riparian shrub. Being a willow, it's very flexible. So the waters can rush over this, rocks can roll over it and stuff, and it can still just flip back up once the storm's over. Sometimes they'll get so much gravel goes through them that all the bark is stripped off, but then they just free sprout from the base the next season, and within 2 years you don't even know anything happened. The beauty plant of the cedars, of course, though, is the rhododendron, which mostly follow the creeks. They're usually not in the creeks, but they're right nearby where they can get underground water and some color variation. And interesting enough, one of the insects that was just identified in the cedars has a life cycle involving the abundance of western azalea. Coffee berry looks very different in the winter with the beads of water on it and the reflection of the sky on the beaded leaves. The summer is more of an olive color. It has a white underside. Outside of the cedars, you have the typical California coffee berry, Californica, but everything on serpentine is Californica tomentella, beautiful berries, which the bang-tailed pigeons love in the fall. The shrub will be covered with these. It's hard to get pictures. You say, "Oh, I gotta go get a picture of the coffee berry," and then suddenly a swarm of birds descends on and strips every last flower off, berry off. So, but it's their stuff anyway. So, the seepages have a few distinctive plants. Sonoma County, I know technically you have Cypripedium in Marin, and I hope it's doing well. And but in the cedars, it's relatively abundant in the lower canyons and seepages. Here it's under azaleas, these are azalea branches. It's much more common up in Del Norte, Siskiyou, Trinity counties, things like that. But for considering how rare it is in Sonoma County in general, there's certainly probably more Cypripedium in the cedars than there are in the rest of the county combined, and probably by a factor of 10 or more. But anyway, it's a beautiful plant, fragrant flowers, comes up in the spring. They seem to be doing well ecologically. The clumps keep getting bigger. I've seen them sow into new sites, and because I've been going up there for 45 years, you would see them flowering and becoming their own little clumps. And so it's not in retreat at this point in time, and it actually seems very happy where it is there. Beautiful little pouch flowers in the orchid family. The other orchid, the stream orchid, although it's not listed in the Jepson manual because it's a form, the name form is rubrifolia, red leaf. Jepson doesn't recognize anything below a variety. So this plant doesn't exist according to the Jepson manual, but it is one of, in my opinion, a very important endemic of the cedars, which is one of the few places this anthocyanin-enriched Epipactis stream orchid occurs. And some of them are very profound. They're not all that way. Sometimes you have a purple like this coming up to a bright green next to it, but it's a very strong character within most of the creeks of Big Austin Creek. Some of the canyons have almost 100% with anthocyanin pigment in various degrees. Other canyons will be 30%, 30% green, and others mixtures. So it's not a fixed character, but if you dug that up and put it in potting soil from Home Depot, you would still have the same coloration. That's not produced by the serpentine. It's not produced by being in the cedars, but they seem to have either evolved in the cedars, this character, and it's centered there. So I feel it's a sort of a waif of an endemic. Unfortunately, it's the way taxonomy works. You've got to decide what you're going to include and not include. But it's a wonderful ornamental plant. It's one the stream orchid in general is one of the few native orchids that you can actually grow in cultivation. Here it is emerging when they're darkest color. Some are very bright and silvery. You see the other one was black. And if they do maintain their leaves, especially in the shade and wet areas, they're almost always in wet areas, they'll often in the fall lose their chlorophyll, and you'll see the pigment again revealing itself, which is a sweet character. You have this in Marin serpentine columbine, an endemic to serpentine soils, serpentine seepages. This will sometimes actually grow down into the creek bed because it can, if this can get its roots wedge into rock crevices, it doesn't matter that the top gets blown away in the winter from the water. It'll just come up again in the spring, and it actually looks prettier without the dead stuff on top. But very, very easy to grow too. Great ornamental. It self-sows prolifically in the cedars and even downstreams a bit. But as soon as you get too much downstream from the serpentine parts of the cedars, you'll start running into western columbine, which is quite similar, but it's a much bigger flower, a later summer flowering, a bigger plant, and much more beautiful foliage with the silver. Sometimes come out almost with a black anthracite pigment. And then we even found one white, yellow, entirely yellow flowering plant. A few other seepages plants. I can't do through all the plants for any of these things. There's just too many plants there. But there's 3 types of maidenhair fern. This is the Venus maidenhair that goes in about 5 calcareous seepages. I don't know if you have this in Marin. I think you do, but I'm not sure. This is Adiantum capillaris veneris. It's an evergreen Adiantum, as worldwide distribution. So it's not a rare plant in some ways, but it's certainly rare to the cedars, and it's not common. I think there's only 1 or 2 other populations known in Sonoma County. And then the 5-finger maidenhair, which is also just it doesn't have a serpentine affinity. It just loves wet serpentine seepages, as well as seepages in the redwoods, which are not serpentine. This is mostly on the outskirts. And then in a few places, we have the California maidenhair. There's not a picture here. That's up on some of the richer chaparral slopes, although it's quite rare within the cedars. It's more common in East Dawson Creek drainage, where you have more wooded areas, very old wooded areas. And then this sedge is a wet-growing sedge, Carex mendecinensis, which is a serpentine or seepage endemic. It's not a cedars endemic, but every time you see this plant, even if you can't see water, you know there's moisture underneath. It's a very pretty evergreen sedge. And the grass of Parnassus is quite common in the seepages of the cedars. Begins flowering in late August, and sometimes it'll be flowering into December. The peak flowering is always October, November. Beautiful. It's like a white buttercup, but it's of course not related to that. Of course, those of you who hike up in the mountains will see this regularly up in mountain meadows and stuff, but at low elevation, it becomes much scarcer. I know there's some in Marin, and there's some in the South Bay and the Clear Creek drainage, and probably a few other spots up in Colusa County and some of the serpentine seepages there. But it's never abundant. The cedars, it can be quite abundant though, and it's actually a very beautiful plant. I've never had any luck growing it in cultivation, but it's still very nice. So the last habitat are the rocky barrens, which are very dramatic, visually beautiful in the winter, where you have the deep shadows and all the topographic relief is etched in the shadow. It's really a very dramatic. In fact, that opening picture was actually looking down that canyon. But in some perspectives, it looks like most of the cedars is rock, and indeed a lot of it is, but still this is looking south, so you have the drier perspective, and there are a lot of barrens. There are not too many plants that like the barrens though, because it's such a harsh environment. First of all, they're constantly falling apart, and you've got little rock particles accumulating talus slopes. Some just wash away and go downstream, become riparian alluvial deposits, or probably some of it goes out to Jenner or in the ocean. But it's I don't know why I went backwards, but there's a few plants that are really keen and to see, and the very common perennial is this Phacelia corymbosa, the serpentine Phacelia. This in the summer looks like a black, dried up, dead plant. You'd think, what the hell was that? And a week after the first rains, it's putting out new silvery leaves, and then at the end, during the winter and into the late spring, you have these small white flowers, which are pretty, but then it quickly goes dry in the summer. And then there's a number of annuals that love these little rock particle slopes, which are extensive, including there are two species of Claytonia. This is the exigua. This is the hardy, the harsher growing one, the spring beauty, Claytonia exigua. Here you see a penny for scale. They can be bigger too in the lush situations, but this is also a very early things like the milkmaids. This will be up now, and we have a sunny week ahead. There'll probably be some of this flowering. And then if we have too long of a sunny period, they just set seed and dry up and blow away and wait for the next season. But one of the jewels of the serpentine barrens is the serpentine milkweed, Asclepias solanawana. The cedars isn't particularly rich in this. It has many of them, but you have to really search them out. But it's worth searching out in the flowering period because they are, it's probably one of the most beautiful milkweeds, if not in California, in the world. And there are some great milkweeds, but it's just really, the buds are gorgeous, the leaves are gorgeous, the flowers are gorgeous, and growing in this amazing habitat. One of the geologists that was visiting, I took him up to a site up one of the canyons, and there was just one mat of this. And then, but he was like, oh, well, I gotta get some rocks up here and stuff. They came back to the camp, and I said, what did you like the most up there? He said, oh, that's serpentine milkweed. So it was kind of cool that this geologist just suddenly like glommed onto the beauty of this very rare plant. It's very common in some places to the north, like up in Trinity County and Colusa County, even in Sonoma County on the Geysers Ridge, there's quite a bit of it. And then one of the endemics is the Cedars buckwheat. James Reveal, who with me published this. It's one of these serpentine tailless buckwheats that form a sort of a related group, but the cedars, again, you saw that geology picture, completely removed from other serpentines. In the eastern part of the North Coast Ranges, you have nervulosum, which has a cream flower that turns pink. That's a snow mountain buckwheat, but in the West County, we have to deal with this thing. But anyway, it's a beautiful plant, fairly rare on the tailless slopes. There are a lot of tailless slopes that don't have this, but then there are tailless slopes where it's very, very common. It's a very beautiful plant in late June, early July, when it's in flower. The seed heads the flowers are yellow, they go to browns, and they actually, if it's not too windy, you'll hold on to the seed heads. You can see some of the other plants here. They're Eriogonum luteolum and things like that. There's skeletons from Eriogonum nudum, the skeletons from Streptanthus morrisonii, and things like that. Also in these barrens, because they're skeletons, you don't really see them. This is the largest plant I've ever found. You could almost make a bedding out of it. But we've recently had Travis Columbus, who's taking over some of the work that excuse me, Dr. Sorry, forgive me, but he's doing genetic studies now, a lot of the genus. And then there's the jewel flowers. You could do a whole show on jewel flowers, probably, especially even in Marin, you could do just the Marin ones. But this used to be considered an endemic. It's Streptanthus glandulosus. It's part of the glandulosus complex. It's a subspecies Hoffmanii, named in honor of the first botanist of the cedars, Fried Hoffmann. and very beautiful pinkish one. It's not that black purple like you see in Niger or some of the other races of glandulosus. Very beautiful. Used to be thought an endemic of the cedars. Art Kruckeberg named it, he was a serpentine expert, and he did a lot of work with the genus Streptanthus. But now in the past decade or so, there people keep finding it further and further afield. So we can't call it an endemic. We can't even call it a Sonoma County endemic anymore because it's been found out of the county, but it's still a beautiful plant, and we're very lucky to have it. It's one of those plants after fires, far more numerous, but it actually sustains itself because there's so much open talus. But it's the less common of some of the jewel flowers in the cedars. This is on the outskirts of the cedars. I meant that contact zone. The pink or rosy pink Hoffmanni is replaced by subspecies sonomensis, the Sonoma bearded jewel flower, which is a Sonoma County endemic, but not a Cedars endemic. And as I said, there's a geographic gradation between Hoffmanni in the interior canyons and sonomensis on outside of the cedars on the outskirts. Going backwards, but never see too many Streptanthus. The most common species numerically is a small annual selfing flowered species called bearded jewel flower, Streptanthus barbour, that germinates in late January, grows in February, forming these beautiful, strange, leafy rosettes of various colors and stuff. It almost looks like some of them are trying to camouflage themselves on the ground. You can see how the colors mimic the pebbles and stuff, but there are a whole range. Some have more red in them. And then right around the middle of April, they suddenly start bolting and producing a central stalk, which will be the flowering stalk, where the leaves change from these Lisa Simpson hairdo type things to linear leaves that are completely different. And here it is in flower. Oops. All right. Very small flowers that sometimes you can walk through these and suddenly realize there's 100 you've just been walking over and you haven't paid attention to them. But if the light hits them right, they can be little showy. But you see this one has already, the basal leaves are usually totally gone by the time it's in flower, which probably contributes to the fact that it's often described without basal leaves. But they do have basal leaves. People have to catch up with reality. Anyway, this is another Streptanthus. These were named by Hoffman, the early botanist at the Cedars, and he named it in honor of his, a good friend who was another Streptanthus enthusiast, John Morrison, who lived in the Grenville area for a while. His family lived in Rio Negro. This is a biennial species. It has a whole season where it sits out as a small juvenile, and if it survives the summer without drying up, as soon as the rains come, it starts growing and then produces this big candelabra branch thing with tiny flowers on it. Hoffman named two entities from the Cedars, the more widespread variable one, Morrisonii, and then in East Dawson Creek, he named a separate subspecies Horticulturist. But in recent work in the Jepson Manual, all the Morrisonii group has been lumped. There were also some named from the geysers and up in near Middletown on White Peak, but they're now all lumped together. So the distinct species, the Horticulturist used to be a fairly rare endemic for the Cedars, but someday they may be revived again. The Streptanthus names come and go, and the pairing of them, I think they've figured it out pretty well. But you see the flower color can be very variable on the most common. Some are green, some are yellow, some are whitish, some are purple. They can be densely hairy. They can have not a single hair on them. So you never know what you're going to run to. You have a purple one next to a green one, and that's just the way it is. but it's a beautiful odd streptanthus, which originally was known only mostly from the immediate Sonoma County and Napa County, but people kept finding them more like up in Frenzel Creek and uh, uh, Walker Ridge and places like that. They kept showing up in serpentine barrens. So it's a, and then in the 80s, I actually, along with Vern Yaden from Monterey, found it down in Monterey County in a serpentine area that always reminded me a lot of the cedars called Los Barros Mountain Canyon. And it was so interesting to go into this canyon and see a plant I knew from the cedars. Uh, so other plants are, there's only one allium in the cedars, Allium falcifolium, but unlike most Allium falcifolium in the North Bay, they're not maroon purple. They're actually pale colored, but that's okay. Cymopteris is very, very common on serpentine, but it's not restricted to serpentine. It's also very common on volcanic outcrops. It looks a lot like a lomatium, but the seeds have wavy margins that are distinct or multiple margins. So it's a very beautiful plant. It has a sometimes called desert parsley or a Great Basin parsley. And I looked it up and people actually used to eat it as parsley. It's kind of intense for me, but anyway, it's very beautiful to look at. It travels underground and can actually form mats through these grasslands I was mentioning earlier. Sometimes there'll be a lone on the rocks, and other times there'll be a whole hillside of it. And interestingly, it's a larval food source for the Anis butterfly. Will come into the Cedars Canyon. It's the only, actually the only carrot family big present. Well, there's one Carota, Adelphus carota, but the Adelphus bacillus, I'm sorry. But it's the Cymopteris are after. I don't think you have this in Marin, but you have a lot of lomatium, so they make up for it. The phlox species is a rare plant in the cedars. There's about 4 populations of it, bear grass. Pretty rare, hefty populations, but then it doesn't occur. Erythroniums, mostly in East Austin, entirely East Austin Creek, hillsides of it, and then it stops. Beautiful plant though in March. The ground cone, both Copsiopsis, rare, but I think a lot of it's because it grows under chaparral and people don't like climbing through manzanitas. And then there's a bunch of uncommon annuals like the Griffin's bellflower, which is an uncommon annual, especially between fires. A little white thing, you again, in one of those things you could be eating lunch on it before you notice it. But it's a neat thing we have there. So I just want to deal a little bit with fire. How am I doing, Christine? Do you want me to stop? Or?
Oh, well, people can leave if they want to. I say carry. Pardon me. Carry on.
Okay. Anyway, the parts of the cedars did burn in the 2020 Walbridge fire, and some of it was a very old Sergeant Cypress woodlands with deep woodsy canyons. The slopes down here would be places like we have the Fawn Lily and things like that. But you can see the fire didn't go up to the ridge in most places. At a couple places it touched the top of the ridge, but it never went over into East Austin Creek. West Austin, Big Austin Creek. Here's a map. You can see the fire zone. This is East Austin Creek itself. The roads in East Austin Creek. This is the edge of the fire. This is a convenient map of BLM parcels, this orange outline. They own 2,000 acres of the cedars. This is incorrect here. It right goes over here now up to here, up to there, and then down to there. So the BLM is a major landowner in the cedars of the 6,000 acres, but all the periphery is owned by private landowners, so that none of the BLM land is accessible to any public road. These roads that come into the cedars are private roads, as the roads that come into East Austin Creek are private roads. So just factoid. After the fire, the hillsides are orange with the bonfire moss, plants that you sort of ignored before, like the the cotton stackies, stackies albans, were just such beautiful, radiant, silvery white patches that you could see them across the canyon and say, oh, there's the seepage over there. Whereas before they'd be, in cypress forest and bay forest and things like that. There are two plants that I had noticed a few incidental ones here and there in the like the first 30 years. The solanum and bee plant, Scrophularia californica, but they've always were isolated, one plant here, one plant there. They sometimes came up around fire rings, but I was never sure it was birds bringing them in, pooping them out, or whether they were actually hidden plants in the cedars. And this fire verified that they are fire followers. And in the burn zones, they repeatedly came up throughout the area, especially the solanum. But they will only last a few years and disappear again. I had been curious about this one because we actually, I have a friend who, Rick Murray, and his family had a ranch there, and unfortunately, there were so many of their buildings were burned out, and a heartbreaking situation there. No one lost lives, but people who had their homes back in there were a lot. There were some that survived, but some didn't. But we had, when we were hiking, Rick and I were hiking in the East Austin Creek drainage, we were like, we came across this pot grow in one obscure little side canyon, and everywhere they had planted a pot plant, there was a Scrophularia or two coming up. And I was like, did they bring this in their potting soil? Or is this was in the soil and just a disturbance of growing pot, let it come up? And it turns out it was in the soil. So it was an interesting mystery solved. And even in non-serpentine, it's a fire follower. This is a great example of abundance from fire following. There was we only knew about 5 flannel bushes in all of the cedars. And 4 of them were over in East Austin Creek. And my friend Rick had discovered 2 of them. And in this little gully over here, and we had looked at them for years. And then after the fire, we decided to visit it again in the second year post-fire, and we went to look for them. And because they were hanging down actually into this gully, they had escaped the fire. Here it is, be on the flower. You see the little round leaves. That's why I call it Nepenthe. It's not recognized anymore, but it will be someday. But after the fire, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them came up, which suggests to me, I know in Marin you have an issue with Fremontia. I would suggest the fire therapy might be one way of building up that population. It's just the seeing what the seed was there. I mean, most of these probably killed themselves out since, because you can't grow 2 inches, an inch apart from each other. But it was just an interest in nature, a lesson from nature. Eriophyllums, Linatum, just everywhere after fires. Hillsides and hillsides of golden yellow daisies. You see all the dead cypresses. Bush poppy, which had been rare. My friend Rick kept saying, why don't I see more bush poppies? And I said, well, they're probably here somewhere, probably after a fire. And sure enough, after a fire, there are acres and acres and acres. Everywhere there was solid Sergeant cypress was masses of bush poppy. And right now, probably we're at 6, so it's going 7 years after the fire, 6 years after the fire. These are actually coming to senescence. This is year 3. These were head high. And other things are growing back, the leather oaks and things, the bays and stuff like that. So they're going to go back into their seed mode. And who knows the next 100 years, 200 years, when it is before anyone sees bush poppies again. But it's just astounding to see the numbers of them that come up. And here's a little Sergeant cypress starting. Yerba Santa, which is also fire follower. Some of the grasses came back. This is Melica Toriana. Manzanita's back there. Again, more grass. And this little plant I'd never seen in the cedars before. And it was a roadbed. Let me go back here. And it's definitely a Hesperevax acaulis, whether it's the variety Ambosticola, which is very rare and previously unknown from Sonoma County. I'm not quite sure. I did take an herbarium specimen of a piece of this in the second year. By the third year, there were none present anymore, and probably no one will see Hesperevax again for God knows how many decades. But anyway, to switch from plants, there are a lot of other things going on in the cedars, particularly scientific. And it all started with when I first started exploring the cedars when we bought some property in the late 90s. I had a lot of questions, and the curator at the Botanical Garden at the time was a geologist, and he said, "Well, I'm especially a volcanologist. I don't know anything about serpentine." So he said, "Oh, contact Dr. Coleman at Stanford. He's the world's authority on serpentine." So we did, and he came up to the Cedars, and he had been there in his youth as a graduate student working with some early USGS scientists, Barnes and Blake, and a number of other people who wrote a bunch of papers, did a whole thing on the Cedars, ultramafic, massif, and stuff like that. But the one thing that really here is in its 80s, but he came back several times. But he was a really, really, really nice guy. Learned a lot of stuff about the ultramafics that we were looking at, because neither Dave or I knew anything about really much about serpentine. I knew a little. I've seen a lot, but no one really went through it, but just step by step with me. But he suggested that he said, there's lots of other things going on here. Why don't you get a whole mix of scientists up here? I'm sure they'd be interested in these ultrabasic springs. They'd be interested in that and this and that and aging things and finding out where the water comes from. And so we started doing that and formed the Cedars, Dave, Cedar Science Program. And we made contact with Bob Coleman made contact with people at USC and Ken. I'm forgetting names. Anyway, I'll get to it later. And they had various groups come. Some stayed for a number of years. So a whole bunch of various science and research projects, seed collection, seed banking of rare plants, the Cedars manzanitas. Holly was there getting Eriogonum cedrorum for long-term storage. And we had a lot of groups that Heis Kunin, who's an expert in microbial life in sewers in the Netherlands, was encouraged to come over to help try to figure out the mysteries of these ultra-basic springs. Here he's teaching people how to collect water. We had insect, there was a mystery cycad for years and years. Everyone wanted a live mystery cycad. And last year, Elliot Schmidt and came out, and he actually got them. And they wrote a paper on it and described it. It's known for a very small area around the camp kitchen area, the grotto pool area, for those who know the Cedars. And as far as maybe other plots of the Cedars, but we haven't really done, there's still more work to do. The CNPS did mapping in the Cedars. Here's my dog Sergeant, named after the cypress. Found a good back support out there on the Barren, which pretty hard to find shade. Daniel Parter, another holodiscus expert. When we were rewriting the paper on the holodiscus, we had bryophyte groups for determining all the mosses, the liverworts, the lichens. I didn't show you any of them because there's too many things to show you. We had an expert out, Pratchett Jane, who spent one night there and found there were 4 species of scorpion living at the Cedars. one only in the talus slopes. And I thought, oh, there's one there, you know. Though someone had found another one, we'll get to that later, um, but it's just nice to see your knowledge of this area suddenly expand. It's like, oh, we don't just have one scorpion, we got four of them. John Emmel helped with all the butterflies and Lepidoptera and Peggy Morrill and a whole bunch of people just came back again and again and did years and years, wrote numerous papers. A lot of the different people collaborated on these papers. Once they found microbes, unique microbes in these springs, they were like, well, how are they staying alive? What are they eating? What are they breathing? What are they pooping? You know, it's like, it was like, and, you know, so it was years and years that it was very hard for them to cultivate these in the lab. And then there's another group that came up just in the last 3 years, and the fungal diversity group, which survey group, which has been fabulous. They just turned up so many new things that, you know, I've been going there for it's 45 years now. They're turning up things I never even imagined occur there. They're not just in the fungus, but they're real fungus pros. But they just they know where to look. They know what everything is. It was really eye opener. Really intelligent, wonderful people too. They found this fungus, a U club, which had previously been thought known in Northern California and into Oregon, because it had been thought to be dependent on Taxus brevifolia, the California, the Western U needles to grow on, but here it is growing on the cypress needles and the cedars. And I noticed from iNaturalist, someone found this down in the Bohemian serpentines under Sergeant Cypress. So people are finding, you should look for it on Mount Tam too. And then another thing, they found Damon found these underground, these like 4 inches underground. How do you even know they're there? He starts digging around and says, oh, look at, well, here's one, and it cuts it open. And these are more relatives of the, not morals, what am I thinking of? Truffles, but they're not edible, this group, Chanella. But it was interesting, these are all little spore capsules which are attached by a sticky membrane, and you can actually touch them and they'll stick to your finger, and you can pull it like that far out, let it go, and it flies back. But the plant obviously gets on other things that travel through the soil, and they carry the spores around. But when he did the genetic bar graph of this, it showed the closest relative of this known currently was the same species growing in Turkey. And who would have thought, you know, this species from Turkey would turn up underground in the cedars. And then I noticed again on iNaturalist, there have been someone found this in Marin County recently. So it's you know, interesting, exciting other people and stuff. Ken Nielsen, that's what I was thinking of. He was with USC and the Jet Propulsion Lab and the Craig Venter. He co-authored a lot of the papers with a bunch of people. Here's some of the scientists. These guys invented a flow-through electron microscope so they could count and look at the microbes going through the tubes and stuff like that. It was just really wonderful what we found out. Here's a geologist looking for the perfect rock up there, and Shino, what a powerhouse. She's been coming back and forth to the cedars from Japan for 20 years and involved with so many of the major papers that you'll find if you search for the Cedars of Sonoma County microbes or gases or ultrabasic springs, hyperalkaline springs. There's a whole trove of scientific literature now that these people have created. And then the last person I really have to thank is Betty Campbell, who was warmly welcomed me into her home on my first hike into the cedars, and not only invited me to continue my exploration, but to come back and keep in touch with her. And she had a love of science. Every time we had a scientist up there, She wanted to meet them. She'd host dinners for them. She was just a real powerhouse, a real hostess. Loved the fact that people were finding out new things of the cedars, and I was bringing them up there. It was like she was unfortunately she's deceased now, but her daughter and son-in-law live up there, and they continue the tradition. But anyway, it's been a great experience, a big part of my life, and I'm so happy to share a little bit of it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Roger. That was absolutely terrific. And we have some comments mainly in the chat. Excellent presentation, Doreen and Vernon complimented you. Streptanthus barbature, color variations matching habitat, possibly due to selective pressure.
Who knows? That hasn't been investigated.
No,
But
and you will often see, even next to plants that they're super well camouflaged, suddenly there'll be one that's like chartreuse and stands out like a sore thumb. So
yeah, I think it is somewhat accidental, and maybe there's some percentage that benefit from it. Um, but they don't actually ever seem to get eaten. So the camouflage may have been a carryover from some previous millennia or something where they did have a more immediate function, or maybe it's just some random thing that may prove in the future be more of a benefit for them. But I don't really know for sure. I'm always amazed every spring. I usually sit down on them before I see them, and then that's something like, oh wow. And they're so beautiful. They're almost like snowflakes. They all seem to be trying to be different, little unique characters in this when they occur by the tens of thousands.
and apropos the Cypripedium growing in Marin, it was last seen about 100 years ago in the serpentine below Bootjack, but hasn't been seen there since. So presumed extirpated.
I thought I saw on Facebook someone found leaves of it in a seepage somewhere, but hadn't seen a flowering plant. But I don't know who that is, and I don't have the reference at hand. But
No, David
it,
Greenberger might know.
yeah.
And David McCrory thanks also partners at the US BLM Ukiah field office.
Oh yeah, they've been great partners over the years. Mostly, originally there were very few people in the office up there. So whenever they got I want to look at Streptanthus, and you have this place called the Cedars. How do I get there? And they didn't have the personnel to drive people down, or they didn't have the keys to the gate. So they'd say, oh, contact Roger or Dave, and if they can get you in, you're lucky. And we tried to accommodate all of those because we loved learning more about all the soil pathogens and this and that. And the new office, we've just recently had contact with them. They've got a new staff, and they have a lot more people. So they actually have shown some interest in taking over a lot of the science work, or maybe sharing it with us. We don't know how. They actually have to pass through our property to get to their property. So hopefully everything will be very collaborative, and we have great memories of groups of them coming down, and they even had a West Coast BLM, group picnic at the Cedars back around 2012 and stuff like that. So they love the fact that it's a pristine habitat. They don't have to do anything about it to keep it that way. No one can get there without special permission from the surrounding landowners. And so it's like a carefree jewel that they own.
Right. So one person asks here, is there a way to visit the Cedars? Given that.
Only through contacting a surrounding landowner.
Right.
And unfortunately, we're one of the few people who do it. My neighbor, the Carleys, Barbara will take, she has hiking groups that she takes on sometimes, but they're more duration hiking rather than botanical hiking. But she learned all the plants of the Cedars after we bought property there, she just went around with me and say, that's a cypripedium, click. That's a epipactis, click. You know, she knows where they all are. And it was a pretty amazing education. And she has a better memory than me.
And David also posts in the chat that there's a website where you can go for a free downloadable guidebook to the cedars, www.thecedars.us.
Yeah, that was on the opening page too. Yeah, that's a great thing to see. It hasn't been updated. There are a few mistakes here and there, and it would be nice to get it updated. But we updated it 2 years ago, so it's not totally off update. It takes a more large, more holistic look at the cedars. It not only includes the interior canyons, but it includes that outer ring, and actually the sort of a buffer zone around it. So it's less focus on the exclusivity of the cedars than just what's in that the biologically that whole zone of Sonoma County, the headwaters of the Austin Creeks. But there's a lot of that hasn't been explored. The western drainages, there's one ridge heading off in the northwest that's entirely grassland. I don't have a clue what's on that. I've only seen it. I've never had the time. By the time I've been able to hike over there, you have to turn around and head back. So, and I don't have the energy anymore. You could drop me from a parachute maybe, but there are roads back there, and maybe landowner contact. We can get some more botanists back into that area. I think would be exciting as a possibly new taxa, and resolving some of the taxa like the Morrisonii group, jewel flowers. There's so many. Each canyon has its own subset of slightly different things going on with the flowers. So not that you want 50 different streptanthus taxa, but there's some ways of clumping them or genetically linking them that would be interesting to have done. I don't think any genetic work's been done.
And then Clint Kellner asks, could you please mention the species of plants that formed the transition between the serpentine of the cedars and the adjacent non-serpentine soils? That's probably a pretty big list.
That's a big plant list.
Yeah. It's
there
more
are few things that very few things that I've seen that are unique, but there are a number of things that are out there that are not in the canyon. Like there's a polygola, one of those little annual knotweeds, which I'm sure is Polygola spurgularia, the spurry spurgula. Although I just saw in the review of the Sonoma Flora people chat that actually they didn't think that existed in the county because they'd never seen the specimen. But of course, they haven't seen my specimen. So there are plants like that. There's more Linanthus. There's things like those little annual Diplocus douglasii, and Diplocus condonii. The white streptanthus glandulosus. There's more dodder. There's a tarweed, Hemizonia luciolifolia, just luciolifolia. A lot of the more common stuff. There's Triteleas, there's Brodia laxa, there's Brodia stellaris, there's not Brodia laxa, there's Brodia Tritelea laxa, there's Brodia elegans and Brodia stellaris and things like that, which are not exceptional plants, but you don't see them once you get into the canyon. So collectively, it makes the serpentine identified flora much, much, much richer. But no one's walked around the whole cedars. It would probably take a week and you'd probably get shot at a dozen times. But it would be an amazing botanical journey with a group of botanists to sort of take camping equipment and gradually circumnavigate the cedars and try to document that whole outer ring. Because I've only been able to access it from a few points that I have access to from the Big Austin Creek side and from where the road going into the East Austin Creek, right at where the road is. But anyway, Yeah, there's still plants to find and document, certainly.
And David McCrory answers Clint's question about what the species of insect was associated with the Western azalea. I mean, sorry,
There was a cicada,
there was a cicada,
that rare cicada that I showed that was described last year.
right?
Monosperma, mono
Okanagawa
uh,
monochroma.
monochroma,
Yeah.
because it doesn't have any color in the other than black. Um, and the females lay there. They have this little sharp hook at the end of their whatever it's called, and they carve a groove into the upper twigs on the azalea, and then they deposit eggs in that groove, and then the larvae eventually hatch, fall to the ground, and are grubs in the soil for many. No one knows for sure. They live in the roots of the azaleas. So um, why that particular cicada wasn't found elsewhere, it's certainly the Cedars doesn't have all the azaleas in Sonoma County, and you have lots of azaleas in Marin County in certain areas, and so it's to be looked for actually. Um, but that was a connection, the cicada.
Okay. And then Nishanta asks if anyone has looked at the saxicolous lichens and bryophytes on the ultramafic and other geologies within the cedars.
They probably have been looked at by the bryophyte group. Has been up there 3 times over the last 3 decades, and they never tell me what they find. It's kind of frustrating. And they're like your classic cats. They all disperse once they get there, and so it's you can't just stay with them and pick up knowledge. You have to sort of latch yourself to one or the other. There probably are, and there are probably ones that haven't been seen. But there are some on the rock. There's particularly one forms these beautiful silver mats and forms rings of rust around it. Um, but I don't know lichens well enough to really comment in too intelligently on that.
And Nick Thayer says he has read a paper that that concludes that high intensity fire on serpentine soils can lead to high toxicity and volatilization of chromium. Are there any known health risks with visiting the Cedars after the Walbridge fire?
No, because follow-up studies of that show that although that happens immediately the year after, within a year of with normal rainfall, all that stuff has been either leached away or chemically reformed, so it's not the very volatile form of hexavalent chromium. But after a fire, probably running around in the dust there would not be a good thing. But most of the landowners there hope there aren't many more fires. But who knows? It's surprising how little of the Cedars show evidence of recent fires. The fire before the Walbridge fire, that is the most recent, was a 1960s fire. And you can still see trees standing up that were burned in that. And the new trees haven't superseded the dead stumps. So it shows that in 60 plus years, the new growing cypresses haven't outgrown the previous cypresses that were there. So it means most of the cypresses in the big, not the huge range, but just the average range are much older than we think. Usually 200 years, probably more. But there's also ultramafics have naturally occurring asbestos fibers in certain areas, and that's a naturally unknown hazard. But that some of the longest lived scientists I know have been the serpentine specialists, so I'm not sure how deadly it is, but I can't make claims.
Okay, I think that pretty much covers it. Yes, encourage your local CNPS chapter to organize a field trip through gardens@planethorticulture.com. So what David suggests. And thank you very, very much, Roger. That was perfect.
Thank you.
So next month we plan to have a program with 2 speakers on myrtle silver spot butterfly and its associated plant Viola adunca out at Point Reyes National Seashore. It's a rare species, and there will be some monitoring taking place of them, of the Viola adunca populations, and hopefully some butterfly spottings starting in April. So stay tuned for that. And I don't think we need to resume and the election. I think we got enough votes, so I think we can end the meeting.
Okay, great.
Oh, Anne, do you think
That's fine.
Okay, terrific. So thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Roger.
I had to
And
get my voice back.
yes, take a drink. See you all next month. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.